For over 60 years, we've been promised robots that can do almost anything. I think robotics has given itself a reputation of being one of the biggest technology overpromises ever. But right now, something's different. In this month, October 2025, over $6 billion have been poured into robotics by some of the biggest names in investing. And they've claimed that their future is physical AI. By the end of today's episode, you'll start to understand what's actually changed, why people are putting so much money into robotics all of a sudden, and whether we're at the beginning of an iPhone era moment or just the start of another period of disappointment. This is In the Loop with Jack Horton. I hope you enjoy the show. So let's start by, setting the scene a little. I think ever since the Jetsons in, I think it was like the 1960s or 70s, had this robot maid, it's been promised by, technologists and robot makers that these are the future of household helpers. And in fact, I think experts, ever since the 1950s have been pretty confident in predicting that, by the year 2000, most American homes will have some form of automation to make coffee or close windows. But I don't think we've ever reached that cool and exciting future, because none of this has happened really, other than the ability, to use a mobile phone app to shut your windows in certain hotels. And also, you can't really forget the awful robot hoovers and lawnmowers that you get in some places. So then, why all of a sudden is someone pouring $6 billion into robotics ventures? Because that's what's happened this month. SoftBank, pretty famous for throwing away money at times, but they've made the headlines recently because they've put $5.4 billion alone to acquire a massive robot division, with the CEO of SoftBank saying that SoftBank's next frontier is physical AI. And Elon Musk in the last month for XAI, so that's his AI startup that's inside of X and Twitter, has actually started hiring top Nvidia researchers to develop what is described as world models. So these are AI language models and systems that give robots an intuitive understanding of physical world objects and gravity and basically how the world just works. There's also been big humanoid robots making strides in the world. For anyone that's been on Instagram and is connected to technology accounts, really, you'd have seen the robot called Figure. So Figure 03 is a humanoid robot that's basically aimed at households to do general chores. And in their videos, you can go YouTube this, Figure's robot has been, picking up clutter or taking clothes out the washer and loading dishwashers. And obviously, as a result, a lot of the ecosystem around robotics is racing to support these smarter robots. So Nvidia have announced Project Groot. So Groot's this basically platform for training robots. They call it for robot intelligence. And CEO of Nvidia, Jensen Huang, actually called this the foundation for making robots one of the most exciting problems to solve in AI today. And there are lots of new breakthroughs coming out to allow robotics to take giant leaps forward because of AI. So as you can imagine, Nvidia has teamed up with basically every single robotics firm in the world, from Agility to Boston Dynamics to startups like Figure and Sanctuary. So obviously there's a renewed focus on robotics right now. And there's a good question, why is this happening? Why is this time different than all the others? And I think that's a really interesting question to ask. And in one word, it's because of AI. Not the term AI that used to be used over the last few decades, but the specific recent breakthroughs in large language models. Because they've completely transformed the way that vision and language is interpreted by machines. So the big bet right now is that these same breakthroughs can give robotics the adaptability and, street smarts that they've historically lacked. So as soon as a human child has been birthed into the world, they can learn things by just picking up a toy or observing people through trial and error. But yet, pre-2020s robots just cannot do that. They're either explicitly coded step by step or trained with very narrow data sets, which means as soon as it encounters something new, it just gets confused. Whereas new large language models, as most of us have experienced, are incredibly adaptable and have a huge amount of training data. So they've really turned this old world robotics, I guess, idea on its head into something that now is potentially very plausible and exciting. For example, Google's DeepMind robotics center model wasn't trained to do one specific task. It was trained to integrate all of its vision and language capabilities. So this robot is able to interpret commands and map them to what actions they should take. So in a demo, when the robot was asked to hand me a green vegetable from the fridge, a Gemini robot arm was able to understand this is a vegetable that's green, this is a fridge, and hand the person the vegetable. And coming back to that XAI and Elon Musk's idea of a world model, this is where models suddenly can teach robots physics. So a world model is essentially an internal simulation where AI can start to predict outcomes of actions before taking them because they just intuitively understand the world. It just adds a massive layer of reasoning instead of just reflex or hard-coded instructions. Another massive breakthrough has been training data and experiential data at scale. Obviously, companies are now using techniques like reinforcement learning in virtual environments. So imagine virtual robots in a video game that are all essentially characters trying tasks in a simulator. So they can learn from failures and share knowledge, but without actually suffering a negative consequence. A good example of this might be learning and teaching them how to stack dishes. And if they fail, they haven't broken a dish in real life, it's just a video game. But all of that data that they're capturing through that trial and error process is maintained in its memory for future interactions. And this is really exciting because, consider hand-eye coordination and just general object recognition. Tasks like distinguishing an open door from an open window used to be something that would be quite difficult for a robot, but modern vision models and all this innovations in training data makes this type of recognition something that's very plausible. And a good example of this is that Figure's CEO, Brett Adcock, actually claimed that their internal AI robot learned how to fold a towel from just 80 hours of training data, which is something that was unimaginable 10 years ago. And we also have things like integrations and connectivity being 10 times better than, say, 10, 15 years ago. We have cloud, Internet of Things, and just frameworks that didn't exist before. A good example is a robot could offload really heavy computations to the cloud, and it could get over-the-air updates like software updates. So when robots learn something in the world, they could then force a software update so all of them then learn something. So yeah, there's been a lot of interesting breakthroughs and partially explains the rise in excitement and investment levels into the field. However, and it is a big however, it's just never that simple. Because I think before we get carried away with all these exciting demos, it's important to note some of the real big challenges. Because even today's most advanced robots are still struggling with basic tasks in very controlled environments. A Time reporter noted that during Figures, that robot figure that I mentioned earlier, during their towel folding test, that robots were caught frequently dropping things, being unable to pick the towels up, and having to have an engineer come sort things out. I'm not just criticizing them for the sake of it or trying to find gotcha moments. These are just real challenges that they really need to overcome if this is something that's going to generate revenue and deliver value in a house. And I think this really speaks to hype cycles, because historically there's been lots of AI and robotics hype cycles. Hype builds, big expectations form, and then obviously reality triggers a big crash to earth and a collapse in funding. We saw this in the late 1880s and then again in the 2000s when consumer robots with those, rubbish Hoover robots popped up everywhere and everyone thinking that it was going to be the next big thing. But after 2015, when lots of high-profile robotics companies were shut down, then investors grew quite wary and just refused to put money into the sector. Even some of the really exciting companies that you've probably seen all over YouTube, Boston Dynamics, that robot that's kind of painted yellow, the dog that runs around, the robot that does backflips that you can't push over. I mean, their videos have been super viral, but they've still not made any money. Google bought it in 2013, but finding no near-term product market fit, they sold it to SoftBank in 2017, and SoftBank then sold it to Hyundai in 2020 for about $1.1 billion. And the real issue is that Boston Dynamics never found any mass market applications. They started selling Spot, the robot dog, in 2019, but it cost $75,000 each. And really, it was just doing inspections around building sites. Atlas, the humanoid robot, was the exact same. It was a very expensive prototype with no real clear path to being usable by the mass market. It's just too early. And so, yeah, I think we can sum up robotics challenges into 3 core buckets. First is real-world performance is just completely unproven. You know, robotics demos are notorious for being very controlled with mock kitchens, engineers, even controllers. And a task like unloading a dishwasher that might take us 2 to 5 minutes might take a robot 20 minutes or even longer to train to do it. Assume it doesn't get stuck or break all the glass. Second, robots are just very expensive. You know, Agility Robotics has a humanoid robot and it costs about $150K. Tesla's Optimus has tried to target a $20K price tag, but that's going to be years away. And at its current prices, the return on investment for this general purpose robot is completely unproven. We could be decades away from this being a reality. And third, the struggle with real edge cases and generalizations. A robot might do a really good job of folding some towels, but when that towel is wet or if it's got lots of tassels on it, then often a robot will get quite confused. So it's got a lot of training data and innovation still to take place before a robot can really adapt to real-world scenarios. So yeah, to conclude, if I ask the question of do I think AI-powered robots are here to stay and ready to empty the dishwasher? No. After digging through all the evidence, the answer is definitely no. Or maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe it's not quite yet. But what I would say is that this moment starts to feel a little bit different because there are real big technology breakthroughs which overcome some of the major challenges robotics has faced over the last 50, 60 years. There's also huge investment going into the sector, and many companies that were badly burned before are starting to come back to the table. Because I think most people all know, acknowledge, recognize that it might take 5 years, it might take 50, but robotics is going to be a major leap and one of the most influential pieces of technology in human society. And really, if you think about how technologies typically spread, I expect industrial adoption first, then gradual home integration over the next 6 to 15 years. And I know that's a big window, but it's so hard to tell. History then gives us a lot of clues. Smartphones went from about 0 to 50% global adoption in about 10 years. Personal computers took 15 to 20 years. Even robot vacuums, launched in 2002, took 20 years to reach 14% of US households by 2023. So yeah, robots and the technology surrounding them are getting bigger and more well-funded, with a lot of clever people being attracted to the sector, but it's still far off. And in many ways, the real questions we should start to ask ourselves throughout this next period is, are we as a society ready for them? I think that's an even bigger and more important question, one for another day. But anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I'll see you next week.